It's a great privilege to be here. I did want to get a sense of how many people were here for my talk on Everett Ormsby hoax on Monday with a show of hands. Good, okay. So those of you who missed that talk, maybe you heard about it. Those of you who attended that talk, this is going to be a talk in which I unpack many of the things that I did in the talk on Monday. So this will provide a context for thinking about my artistic practice, because what I did on Monday was really a performance in which I used my own art as props to tell a story using the kinds of conventions that a historian would use, a scientist, a curator, or what have you. When I was an undergraduate student, I started doing work like this. And I'm not going to take you all the way back to that early work, but I just wanted to talk about how your experience in the foundation core classes is something that can, I think, really build to thinking, for at least for me, the way I think of my own practice as a way of connecting all the parts of my education. And a lot of it goes back to my own foundation experience for my own studies and trying to make the connection between three-dimensional forms and two-dimensional forms, between hand-drawn things and photographic things. And this is before the personal computer, so other tools were added to all of that. And then you think about all of that because you're studying art and design in the context of a university. So how do your experiences in your general education inform your development as an artist too? So in the early years when I gave talks like this, it was on the subject of mock archaeology. But really I think more broadly about this as things related to the idea of mock documentation. But before I talk about that, I just want to address briefly some ways in which I think about science and the subjectivity involved in it, a kind of aesthetics involved in it, by showing examples of 4 different artists. So you may be familiar with the story about Durer's woodcut of the rhinoceros. Durer never saw a rhinoceros. And yet it's really interesting to consider how the written descriptions of the rhinoceros and the information that came to him provided a basis for this. And I think it says something about the importance of imagination, like our ability to visualize something we can't even see. Einstein talks about that. Knowledge is not nearly as important as imagination. And I think as people who are studying studio art and design, we play an important role in terms of the academy and what our contributions can be. We can be like Durer. We can fill those missing spaces in knowledge. And many of the examples I'm drawing from are ones from the history of print. So I've always been really interested in that edge between fact and fiction in Piranesi's views of Rome. So in the 18th century, he's envisioning an ancient Rome in which his own imagination is sort of completing these pictures in a variety of different ways. So they may be familiar sites like the Roman Colosseum, but if you've ever been to Rome, he had to envision that perspective that he couldn't achieve because there wasn't a building looming over the Colosseum to draw this. So how does our ability to visualize things in the world serve as a form of knowledge, a form of aesthetics? How does he monumentalize this view of ancient Rome? I'm also interested in increasingly in ideas of natural history and its representations. And so we have such wonderful, yesterday I went with one of the drawing classes over to the Life Sciences building, and to draw from those specimens, there's such a long tradition in the biological sciences of artists being interested and involved in that. So you look to someone like Audubon and his Birds of America. He had to, of course, shoot these specimens, right? Which appalls some ornithologists. But the ways in which he composes this to show their wings and so forth, these are sort of, there's a kind of unnaturalism and an invention involved here. This is more akin to flower arranging, in terms of how he's positioning these things on the page. And of course, you all know about figure-ground relationships, so Audubon couldn't get away without using figure ground as well, right? Or especially the the work of Ernst Haeckel, who was a contemporary of Darwin, and did really more to advance public understanding of evolution through his representations of marine life and so forth. And I look at these and is it science or, this would be a great wallpaper pattern, don't you think? Or, there's a sense of decoration, ornamentation. And so just incredible stuff. So what I find really interesting about this too is this is the stuff that your art history teachers are not teaching you about. So, there's all sorts of interesting questions of exclusion from history. But I think these sort of traditions in science and its relationship to art is often one of them. So as we proceed, I'd like you to sort of think about some of these ideas, the notion of reproduction versus representation versus emulation, where you're trying to be like something and how that's different, a different form of, different from reproduction and representation. But in the context of what I'm going to talk about ironic imitation. And in her book, A Theory of Parody, Linda Hutcheon defines parody as ironic imitation of a specific work, a genre, or discipline to comment on a canonical aesthetic, theory, or object text. So ironic imitation of one, a specific work, two, a genre, or three, a discipline. What I'm really interested in is the ironic imitation of a whole discipline. Most of the art parody we see is what Leo Steinberg calls intertraffic art. And an example is here. Mona Lisa is not only one of the most valuable works of art in the world, but it's also one of the most parodied works of art in the world. So you have, Osama bin Lisa up there, and Mickey Lisa, and I think this is lots of fun. It's a great way of sort of poking a hole and making fun of sort of the authority of Leonardo da Vinci and the Mona Lisa, etc. But it has limited value because it hasn't chosen a target that is big enough. If you really want power, if you really want to be the court jester, why not choose a target that's worthy of your energies? So you can look to sort of the idea of the parody of a discipline as a way of thinking about that. And for me, there's several interesting places to draw from. I'm thinking about mock documentation. I don't know if many of you know of the literature of Jorge Luis Borges, the Argentinian writer from the mid-20th century, but he wrote a story called Tulum Ukbar Orbis Tertius, in which he described that the central character finds one volume of an encyclopedia, from a 40-volume encyclopedia, and in that, it describes the architecture, the playing cards, the science, the language, the engineering of this imaginary world called Tulum, and one province from it called Ukbar, created by a secret society, a sort of Masonic group of people from all the disciplines, poets and physicists and every other discipline that would compose a university like this. And they were called Orbis Tertius, Orbis, a circle, Tertius at the third level in underground society. I just love that story and the idea that this world will be presented in the form of an encyclopedia. There's some very good cinematic versions of mock documentation, and your Netflix queue has a whole section called mockumentary, right? And that's certainly connected to this. One of my favorites is Woody Allen's movie Zelig. And Zelig is this chameleon character, who's Woody Allen, of course, who kind of is through history and becomes whatever, the sort of social group he's with. He's like classless, raceless. He has no national identity. He's like essentially a metaphor for the wandering Jew who survives within, very different and varying social contexts. And you're all, I'm sure, familiar with Forrest Gump. It was probably something your family owned, as a kid growing up, and that uses many mock documentary conventions. And then there is This Is Spinal Tap, one of the great rockumentaries, right? So it uses the conventions of the rockumentary, to create this faux rockumentary or this mock documentary. Hey, you know, these are rockers who don't know the difference between sexy and sexist, right? Who don't know if your amplifier goes to 11, it's actually not necessarily louder than one that goes to 10. And in Los Angeles, there's the Museum of Jurassic Technology, wonderfully written about by Lawrence Weschler in his book, Mr. Wilson's Cabinet of Wonder. It's a kind of museum to museums. And you're never quite sure what's real and what's not. And David Wilson, the proprietor of the museum, he never breaks character. He's always, the keeper of the museum. So there's an interesting history in thinking about mock documentation. It raises some intriguing ethical and historical questions. In 1917, the journalist H.L. Mencken wrote in the New York Evening Mail a story called A Neglected Anniversary, in which he notes that the history of the introduction of the bathtub to America had just passed its 75th anniversary without any recognition. And I'll read the section from that article. In late 1843, the Philadelphia Common Council considered an ordinance prohibiting bathing between November 1st and March 15th, and it failed of passage by 2 votes. During the same year, the legislature of Virginia laid a tax of $30 a year on all bathtubs that might be set up. And in Hartford, Providence, Charleston, and Wilmington, special and very heavy water rates were levied upon those who had them. Boston, very early in 1845, made bathing unlawful except upon medical advice. But the ordinance was never enforced, and in 1862 it was repealed. So he wrote a history of the introduction of the bathtub that he completely made up. But everyone thought, this is H.L. Mencken, this noted, respected journalist, was writing about this history. Surely it's real, and he had concocted it, So think of all the things that we regard in the historical narrative that then are open to question and become suspect then. There are political activists who use this sort of issue of the media and the gullibility of the media, like the yes men, who pose as spokespersons for major corporations. More recently, their strategy has been to fix the world. So they become a spokesman for Exxon and say, yes, we did hide a lot of our profits in offshore accounts, and we're going to come forward and pay $3 billion in back taxes as we should. Or they pose as a spokesman for Dow Chemical to say that they will liquidate Union Carbide in order to properly financially recompensate the people of Bhopal, India on the 20th anniversary of it. In the lower left-hand corner is the slide of Andy Bickelbaum giving a presentation to Halliburton executives on this. On the end of that long phallic thing is a TV monitor, so he can manage his workers into the developing world, So here I'll just sort of take you through a kind of survey of different ways of thinking about mock documentation. The Journal of Irreproducible Results, which I referenced in my talk on Monday, actually exists. It's been in publication for over 5 centuries and has articles written by Nobel Prize recipients and people who are leading in their fields, who are essentially making parody science. So they have articles on, thermodynamics and burnt food, the genetics of mermaids. This is an article on feline reactions to bearded men. It goes along with another article on canine reactions to bearded men. This is a proposal to preserve the Grand Canyon and different kinds of styrofoam chips you could fill it with. So these are kind of absurd things, but they use all the same theories and language of science. I teach a freshman class at the University of Tennessee where we study and stage pranks. And one of their assignments is to do annotated bibliographies from this journal. So there's some interesting sort of touchstones for thinking about this kind of academic pranking and mock documentation. One is a well-respected anthropologist from the University of Michigan, Horace Minor, wrote an article called Body Ritual Among the Nasarima in the American Anthropologist in 1956. And Nasarima is American, spelled backwards. And this also relates to a wonderful illustrated book by David Macaulay called Motel of the Mysteries. And so this is the body ritual among the Nasarima, which maybe you've read in the context of a cultural anthropology class, but it looks at 20th century American households and the primacy of the bathroom in those houses. And so the opulence of a house is often referred to in terms of the number of such ritual centers it possesses. And these are places where a culture that's very much fixated on the appearance of the body are involved in, plucking hairs and grooming and this sort of bathing activities of personal hygiene that would make them more attractive and in the public sphere. So it's a very private place where you go and perform these rituals. So that the common house might have pottery tile on the walls, but the person with many bathrooms might have marble and so forth. So and you realize as you're going through this that essentially you're reading about our own culture, our own attitudes toward bathrooms, except from a cultural and anthropological point of view. So in his Motel of the Mystery, David Macaulay does something similar. He imagines archaeologists of the future finding a motel from the late 20th century and misinterpreting all the things they find there, and imagining that the natives would take the collar that they found near the sacred urn that could be removed and put over the shoulders, and there's a small parchment that said sanitize for your protection, which was some mantra you'd repeat and so forth. In the 70s, there were, if any of you are in ceramics, there's a rich tradition of artists who've done mock documentation in ceramics because of its connection to various cultures. I'll show you one of them. This is Clayton Bailey, who created the Bigfoot Museum and the Wonders of the World Museum. And so this is one of the signs for the Wonders of the World Museum. And he's known because he's teaching in Hayward, California, in the Bay Area, for his work on Bigfoot, which of course ran through the redwoods in Northern California. So he would go out and he would make, ceramic bones of Bigfoot, and he'd put them on the beach, and people would come out and look what I found! We found Bigfoot, and call the press. And so he made and then he made these sort of boxes that, so he's a very kind of tongue-in-cheek sort of mock documentary. This is an analysis of Bigfoot droppings. This is the comparative anatomy of the penile bone of Bigfoot with that of the normal human male. And you can see on the left that the penile bone of Bigfoot is triple jointed, which allows Bigfoot to be engaged in athletic mating practices. It's, however, also capable of making a U-turn. So he speculates that this may be the reason Bigfoot is so rare. So he's got other things like fossil testers here. In fact, I think some of you have some devices in the audience here that might kind of resemble a fossil tester. Of course, this is the skull of Cyclops. So if we think of Borges in the encyclopedia, we can look to an artist in the 1970s. He was an architect, a graphic designer, a visual artist. And he created the Codex Serafinaeus, Luigi Serafini. And he wrote it under the pseudonym Franco Maria Ricci. And it has pages of what appears to be like an encyclopedia, except all of this writing is like Dada, kind of absurdist kind of writing. You can't read it. It looks like it's some weird mashup of Thai and Arabic. But it's organized just the way an encyclopedia is, And it has life creatures. On the right is something on optics. There's a special thing on drool writing, like you can analyze drool and find meaning in it. Well, that's what I assume it says, right? A kind of study of different physical types and ichthyology and so forth. So the encyclopedia has often been an inspiration for artists. In fact, Borges, the first time he received a fee for publishing stories, he bought the Encyclopedia Britannica of 1908. And later, of course, he lived most of his life as a librarian. The Maryland artist Sue Johnson created the alternative encyclopedia. In this exhibit, you'd go and there would be like a taxidermied pheasant, this weird chair with horns on it, and there's her painting. So she wouldn't have to make everything. She would just sort of find some of these things and put them together with her painting with this bird-like woman. She had all these pull-down diagrams like you might have in your old high school biology classroom, except what is the woodpecker and the human in the same section for, you know? So she was collaging and combining these things and redrawing them as needed. You know, it's like chipmunk talks in your ear. She also made a lot of kind of pages of this sort. So I think the notion of the collection is really important in terms of a lot of these mock documentary approaches. I showed this last time, and this is the internal anatomy of Pegasus. So in the 1960s, a member of the painting faculty at Cornell, Norman Daly, made a sculptural hat rack, or made a sculpture that he put in the faculty dining room at Cornell University that someone mistook for a hat rack. And at first he was really pissed off, but then he realized that it was his fault, that he needed to control the context in which he presented his work. He was under the assumption that everyone would recognize the genius of his work of art, and they would see that it's not a hat rack, it's a sculpture, right? But that's not the way people are. They need to be led, and they need context for seeing things. And so that that sort of led him to sort of create a whole culture called Luros. And he had over 150 works of art, everything from a small scientific instrument the size of a matchbox to a large facsimile of a temple wall. This is one of the showcases, and on the lower right you can see what's described as a oil container, figurative oil container, hermaphroditic tralid, which you can see in the catalog page here, in the left page in the lower section, described as late archaic or middle period. I'm not really quite sure. This show was first presented in the early 1970s. And if you study that, look at it closely, it kind of resembles something familiar, doesn't it? It looks just like the ivory dish soap bottle, which the profile, you know, like a Coke bottle, hasn't changed in years, right? And so what he would do is he'd take sort of like the Duchampian idea of the ready-made, and acrylic paint had just come out, and he would give these patinas, like they've been found underwater and so forth, and then he sort of relabel them. So a lot of this stuff was kind of a repurposing of our own material culture to create this culture called Luros. He wrote poems from Luros. One of my favorite is the Pilkut love song, which goes, "If you want me as I want you, you would let me die under a petal of your rose, and you would bury me in the lobe of your ear." And he had a Lutheran women's choir singing Lurosian hymns. He had interviews with archaeologists. So he created this whole extravagant culture through these representations. These are Napoleonic troops looking at a Laurentian phallic monument on the left. In the 1970s, completely independent from Daly, they didn't know about his work at all, two women artists created Carulia Ruins and Restorations. They both were Bay Area printmakers, and they made artifacts from this sort of Atlantean culture. And so they presented their artifacts in the same showcases at the Young Museum in San Francisco, where the Treasure of Tutankhamun show that was traveling in the 1970s had ended up. And so the showcases were left there when most of the goods were shipped back to Egypt. And so these are some of the views. They made this game board. No one really knew the rules of the game, but still the playing pieces. They showed the material to two archaeologists who knew it was fiction, but they wrote the preliminary report on excavations at Carulia. So, and then it traveled throughout the West Coast, and at one location, when it was at Cal State Riverside, there was a copper etched plate that was an astral sky chart that was stolen. So then they sent out a press release, rare Carulian astral sky chart, stolen from Riverside Gallery. One of my favorite artists has done mock documentation in all sorts of disciplines is the Canadian Richard Purdy. And I'll show you two of his projects. One of them is, Richard wrote to me when I wrote this piece in the Chronicle of Higher Education, because we realized we were like brothers separated at birth or something, because he was doing very similar things. And That's what I really encourage you to do. If there's an artist who you're really interested in and you feel like some kinship with them, or a writer you're interested in, write to them. That's been one of the most important things that I've done going back to when I was an undergraduate. So I wrote to people like Clayton Bailey and other people when I was an undergraduate. And that was back when, you had to put a stamp on a letter, and there wasn't email and so forth. And, so a lot of the artists that I'm showing you here, there's many more artists I can't even show you, but I've just accumulated all their work. Because like one time someone told me when first time I was going to make an imaginary culture, they said, you don't want to do that. That's already been done before. That's bull hockey. If someone's done it before, that means it might be worth, it'd be like saying, don't paint landscapes, already been done before. Don't draw the figure, already been done before. I mean, if someone's done it before, that means there's shoulders you can stand on. There are people who can inform your practice. If any of you think you're original, you're not, We're sort of limited by our biology, we got to eat, we have to defecate, we have to sleep, we need, visual stimulation, we're not being raised by wolves or something. We live in community, we can learn from others. That's how art is made. That's how culture is produced. That's how you're going to get better. That's because you come to university rather than sitting in your pajamas doing internet learning. You're here to learn from each other, right? And so if you can extend your community, if there's someone you're interested in, you can write to them. So getting back to Purdy, he wrote to me, and so we've been exchanging information since then. We've shown together. One of his projects he made was called Corpus Christi, and it was an imaginary city that was never built, designed by a papal architect, that would be the ideal city. And there's a diagram of it on the left there, and then this is his model of the city. And so the civic body and the human body, this, conceived during the Renaissance, would be the same. So the clergy is in the halo, the government is in the head, the academy is in the left hand, and the theater is in the right hand, where all the arts are practiced. The people are the blood of the city, so they go on the alleys and roads and avenues. Every day they go to the Cathedral of the Sacred Heart to be sanctified. In the lungs are the parks with trees and very airy areas. The navel, they're sort of like the city center there. The area corresponding with the human liver is where the wine merchants were located. The area where the genitals are is thought to be where the brothels are, but that part was erased by a Vatican library a century after the plans were drawn up. The money lenders are in the knees, and the prisons are in the toes, where there's the least circulation. He also created the inversion of the world for Y2K. And a lot of his ideas involve different kinds of inversions. He created a disease called Progeria longevia, which enhances your immune system and extends your life so you live 1,000 years. Sort of as a response to the AIDS crisis. Of course, the problem with that is you outlive all your friends and you become a social outcast. So with this project, he imagined that everywhere above sea level goes below sea level, and everywhere below sea level goes above sea level. East coasters become west coasters and vice versa. Islands become lakes. Continents become oceans. So you want to hope for change, This would be significant. I think this would definitely be like reboot, right? So it's kind of like do-over. Let's start all over again, right? But of course, he uses the form of the atlas to represent it. Kathy Rick, for her MFA thesis at University of New Mexico, created an imaginary convent from Hungary. And the pious young women, the daughters of St. Catherine, starved themselves for the greater glory of God. And she presented it like it was a natural history museum. So she has all the artifacts, the text on the wall. This is her MFA in photography, right? She made artifacts like one of the nuns' hands here, made a fake cover of a National Geographic, which depicts the vomit wands they use to purge themselves. So it's sort of like systematic religious anorexia nervosa, right?
Recently, an artist in New York created a blockbuster survey of 100 artists in 2011, Shea Hembry. And what he did is in 1 year, in 2011, he created art by 100 different invented artists. So he did one piece by each artist. So this is from the catalog showing some of the artists in that show. And so now I'll show you some of sort of a survey of my work and how these other artists inform my practice. And I'm going to show some work that some of it's going to repeat what I showed on Monday, but some of it I'll show you a whole nother project. So a little over 30 years ago, on the suggestion of a friend, I created the Hoax Archives. And of course, it's a pun for the word H-O-A-X, but it's the sort of thing that it's an ironic signal you only get if you say it. Or, you know, I guess I could say it and you couldn't quite, when you see it here, it's hoax. Okay, it's like a name, right? In the early years, for my senior thesis as an undergraduate, I created a culture called the R-Naught. And then for my MFA degree, I created a culture called the Apasht. I won't show you those. But to get tenure at the University of Tennessee, I created a culture called the Azudians. And so in the early years, my work was archaeological, and I mostly worked in ceramics, printmaking, and photography, making these artifacts. So this is the Azudian Temple show. And when I complete these projects, which take about 5 or 6 years, I will build crates for them, and then they travel as traveling shows. So there's a crate that brought some of the prints here, and I encourage you to come by Print Press this afternoon while I will be in character to talk about the work of Reverend James Randolph Denton. But with these shows, I'd be there as the curator, you know, to talk about the work. And I always thought it was really interesting in critique when I was a student, as if you would talk about the work as if you hadn't made it. You had to kind of objectify it and separate yourself from it. And you've all probably had this disembodied experience already with critiques and so forth. So it seemed to me that I could just pretend I didn't make it. I could make art, and I could assume the role of the person who would interpret it, rather than the person who presumably made it. So I would talk about the utopian values of the ancient Azudians, their gods and goddesses, who, like Lakut, the goddess of bread, Eklam and Tulam, the ideal married couple. So with the Azudians, I wanted to create a Garden of Eden, a kind of ideal world. You know, with no system of slavery or military, you know, and so sometimes when people come to these shows, they would poke their head in the door and say, I'm not interested in old ancient art, and they would leave. And so, unfortunately, they never had the experience of even imagining it to be a fiction. But that's okay. I mean, you're not going to get everyone. Some people will miss the point. So I have their architecture, their ceramics, and some people are like, how could you break that? That's a lot of fun, actually. You know, it's fun to break things and glue them back together again. They're actually more interesting. And then it's also fun to draw things that are broken, because it's like you never even have to make it. You could just draw it broken, right? And then you could imagine functions for things that you're not quite sure of. And then so it's one thing to make, so if you go to a real archaeological show, you'll often see biographical information on the archaeologist, right? So, you know, if I go to enough real shows, then I was like, I have to use all of those conventions, because what is history but kind of the history of the scholars? Or these are definitely ironic signals, you know. I just, you know, I made 300 different hieroglyphs. This is just like a design exercise. Come up with a set of pictographs that all fit in the same proportions, right? And you get to about 50, and then it's like, oh, I'm going to run out of ideas here, right? So how do you keep going to nearly 300? Becomes a really interesting problem. So again, more relevance to basic design. For this one, I made a model of the temple, but I never quite finished it. It took up a lot of space. So I just set up the model there and drew from it, and then threw the model out in the dumpster. So I've always been interested in this history of print that has nothing to do with art. It has to do with science. So I created the hoax medical arts with these odd body forms. This one I did in Germany, so I did it in German. I'm sort of interested in that tension between the grotesque and the beautiful. I really want to decorate a doctor's office or hospital waiting room with these, but no one has invited me to do that. So it travels really well, and I've shown it in different places. And in fact, a couple of them are at the Philadelphia Art Museum in a collection devoted to art and medicine. So I guess some of them found their right home. So this is another project. So living in the American South and also being from Wisconsin, there's a great tradition of folk art. And so I'm interested in places that we regard as, things that we regard as authentic. And there's a lot of invested ideology around folk art and its authenticity. So I created the George and Helen Spelvin folk art collection. So like Hembry, but before he did it, this is now like 15 years ago, I created George and Helen Spelvin from Lenore City, Tennessee. And I'll just read you the first paragraph of the text. Visiting George and Helen Spelvin's modest, yellow, split-level house in Lenore City, Tennessee is like making a pilgrimage to a sacred temple of American folk art. While their neighbors purchased bass boats, home entertainment systems, recreational vehicles, and patio furniture, the Spelvins were quietly amassing a significant collection of contemporary folk art. And so this shows it installed. And the first artist they collected is Lucas Farley, who worked at Turnipseed Greenhouse in Poplar Hill, Virginia. And after his mother died, he took his entire record collection and destroyed it by collaging and painting on it, according to the narrative, right? Because his mother was always critical of his taste in music, and he listened to Motown and secular music, and she wanted him to listen to religious music. So he destroyed his entire music collection as sort of honor his mother. So for the exhibit, there's the text panel with biographical information, and then 50 records that have all been painted and collaged on. And so he was the first artist I made, and I sort of imagined making someone like a Howard Finster or something like that, and I would do all this art by that person. But after I made this, it was like, I don't know, I don't want to devote all of it to one artist, so I started making other artists. So Arthur Middleton did portrait paintings of American presidents, everyone from George Washington to Ronald Reagan, with his sons William and Thomas, and they got their fine arts and American history badges with it. P.J. Hipple was on workman's compensation when an engine block fell on his left foot at Dobbs Ford in Memphis, Tennessee, and to sort of pass the time away, he used Pilot fine line pens to do drawings that he called shopping mazes. Charlotte Black was stood up at the altar in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, when her fiance didn't come to the Chapel of Love. But she traveled to Tahiti with her honeymoon package with her best girlfriend from high school. There they saw the work of Edgar Litig, who did black velvet paintings of hula-hooped girls and so forth that sort of go into tiki lounges and so forth in the 50s and 60s. So she returns to Union Church, Mississippi, and she does velvet paintings of brides because she wants to be one herself someday. And she meets Charles White at the bar where she's a cocktail waitress, which explains why there's a lot of beer bottle caps in the frames of it. So I'm spinning these tales about these people who use art to lift themselves up. Max Pritchard rediscovered movable type at a Waffle House in Corbin, Kentucky, when he envisioned the gridded pattern of the waffle would allow him to make letter forms. So he carved them out of floor linoleum and he printed New Testament scripture. Juanita Richardson's father and uncle were alcoholics. Her uncle died of alcoholism. Her father abandoned the family. So she painted returnable beer bottles so they would never be used again to house beer. Lester Coleman Dowdy was like the neighborhood shaman in Alcoa, Tennessee, and he made these puppets that he used in healing dance ceremonies, first for his niece Angela. This is one of his puppets if you got a backache or something like that. And so in my tours of the show, I would say I spent a lot of time with Lester before he passed away, and he taught me a number of his harmonica techniques. So I would take the lumberjack, which you can imagine is sort of bouncing along on the table here, and I'll show you how Lester played the harmonica. And I would do that, I'd play the puppet, and it'd be like, yeah, you know, that's sort of a sense of what Lester's harmonica style was. This is his most well-used puppet. This is the Mr. Stop Smoking, so, you know. Aunt May can't kick the nicotine, so he would dance the puppet, and her desire to smoke would be terminated as a result of that. This one in the middle is by E.B. Hazard, who built it in order to communicate with people on another planet, and so forth. So there's these different artists with these different stories that I would make. And it kind of shook up the folk art world a little bit. They thought that it's, anyways, it was kind of a risky body of work to do, because here I'm a very privileged person, a professor in a society. You know, I've had a university education, a master's degree, and I'm pretending to be poor, Appalachian black, Hispanic, the only Mexican-American face jug potter, and so forth. But what people didn't get is the thing that I'm commenting on are the people who collect that art. And I'm really emulating and celebrating that work because I really love folk art. But it was a risky project to work on. And then the one that I'm presenting here is the Association for Creative Zoology. And this really stemmed from a centaur that we have at the University of Tennessee that was made by a gentleman named Bill Willers in the 1980s, and I helped to raise funds to buy it for the university and put it there. And for 4 years we had panel sessions where our faculty would present the latest cutting-edge research on centaurs. And I gave a talk where I took things like this and said, the centaur is an example of zoomorphic juncture and collage, how God creates new species. And then I set it all aside. And then in the last presidential election, when so many of the Republican candidates said that they questioned the theory of evolution and believed in creationism, I thought, this is incredible. This is great. These are my people. I need to make art for them. So with this project, you know, you look at the history of art, there's all of these examples of zoomorphic juncture. So I went to the Scopes Trial Festival in Dayton, Tennessee, where in 1925, evolution was on trial, and I set up this kiosk with these prints that I made. Later, 3 years later, I took that to the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia and presented it there. So I'm there as a preacher in person. Oops, we missed a slide there. You know, sharing the gospel, trying to reach the children, because they're our future. This is a proposed statue for Central Park honoring Reverend James Randolph Denton. Of course, the duck-billed platypus is an example of creative zoology. And the fish cat. And something's dropped off of there. So it's okay. I know we're just about out of time, so I encourage you to come to Print Press this afternoon. Starting in a half an hour from now, I'll actually be there to share the gospel. And with our last couple minutes, we'll open the floor if you have any questions. Anyone? Yes? Oh, yeah? Yes, please.
Yeah, I was wondering about the hoax presentation you gave on Monday.
Uh-huh.
I guess there's two parts. One, how many people actually believe it?
You have to ask the people who are here.
And two, who is the actual guy that you used as hoax? You know, because you actually had photographs from that time period.
Yeah, I took that out of, I don't remember exactly who it was, but I took it out of an annual report of a chemical company that I found in our library of someone in the 1920s or 30s. So I tried, and then James Randolph Denton that I also showed was from a photograph I got in Covington, Kentucky from, a flea market sale. So I don't want to get people who could be recognized. So it's really important to, in situations like this, to choose people who would be sort of, not represented in the internet and so forth. So you really have to get. I do think that if people left Monday thinking that the Association for Creative Zoology and the hoax archives were real, that's fine. But eventually, they'll develop some awareness of that, and they are going to realize, or there will be some point in that process where they'll go, this can't be real. So I'm interested in the sense of critical awareness that people have to someone who's, selling them a bill of goods. So I think there's a kind of this level of discrimination and critical awareness that can come from being fooled. And so there's an object lesson in that. Anyone else? Well, I hope you enjoyed the talk, and have a great week.